I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Zachary Kallenborn, a policy fellow in the Center for Security Policy Studies at George Mason University, research affiliate in unconventional weapons and technology at START, and senior risk management consultant at the ABS Group. Zachary has an MA in Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and a BS in Mathematics and International Relations from the University of Puget Sound. His work has been featured in numerous international media outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, NPR, Forbes, New Scientist, Wired, Foreign Policy, the BBC, and many others. He joins us today to once again discuss the horrible ways that people kill one another, including drone swarms, weapons of mass destruction, and apocalyptic terrorism. So, Zachary, welcome back, sir. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Russia has launched over 8,000 missile attacks and over 4,500 airstrikes so far in Ukraine. So many that analysts are speculating that they're running low on munitions and they're turning to drones and air defense missiles as replacements. So the Ukrainians, in their turn, are using the Ram 2 drone aircraft and a drone navy as well. Would it be fair to call this the drone wars? And are we seeing a paradigm shift also in military conflict?
Yeah, I think to some degree, like certainly it's not like the first drone war, like in the literal sense, like, drones have been used since World War One-ish, with the Kettering bug in the first instance. But certainly I think the degree to which drones are being used, and particularly significantly across multiple domains, where we've seen Ukraine also use unmanned surface vehicles as well as aerial drones, I think the degree to which they're being used is quite significant. And especially significant there in sort of that drone war and paradigm potential shift is that they're being used against major powers. So many analysts have speculated for a long time that drones would not necessarily be a big deal. We're talking about great power conflict, like killing terrorists in the middle of Afghanistan. Great, wonderful, use it for that type of thing. Little powers who maybe don't have big air defenses, or big air forces, like, yeah, that works. But folks were much more skeptical about using them against like a Russia or like a US level foe. But it turns out actually, drones are actually quite significant. And, given the broad ways in which drones have been used, everything from carrying out strikes to guiding artillery to being used for propaganda, I think there is definitely an element of drones playing a really important part of the conflict. Of course, it's important to not overstate the role of drones either. Like, yeah, I think they get so much attention because it's a relatively new issue to the degree that like they're being used, but like certainly drones are only one part of the much broader conflict, right? Like if drones are being used to guide artillery, then it's really artillery that's actually the thing that matters, but it's just that the drones are improving the accuracy and capability, which that's significant, absolutely. But it's also not necessarily the only factor, right? And so we see also these debates over, say, like, the role of tanks and like missiles and versus like anti-javelin missiles or javelin anti-tank missiles, which aren't necessarily related to drones, but like there are certainly some aspects of it. So I think it's accurate to say like that drones have definitely been a really crucial aspect to this conflict, and I think we can expect to see it play a much greater role in future conflicts as well.
Okay. Well, so by October, Russia had launched over 330 drone attacks, and they'll reportedly be manufacturing 2,400 more of these drones that they purchased from Iran. So at $20,000 each, these are relatively cost-effective, precise, and they're capable of loitering. Do you think these factors combined mean that we'll be seeing a lot more drone strikes in the future in this conflict?
Absolutely. Both in this conflict, I think, well into the future. The reality is that these systems are not necessarily all that expensive. That's $20,000 compared to some of these other missile types, as well as some of the defenses, which is often a particularly significant factor why these drones are being used so much. That is, if you are, say, expending a multi-million dollars for like a Patriot missile to shoot down a $20,000 drone, as you said, that's a huge cost trade-off there. And over a long period of time, over like an extended conflict like we're seeing in Ukraine, that can be pretty costly. And especially because, if that multi-million-dollar system is used to destroy this cheap drone, that missile is also no longer available to strike a much more expensive manned platform. So it can also potentially, waste some of these munitions. So I think absolutely we can expect to see it. And I think more broadly as well, $20,000 is not really all that much money when it comes down to it. Like, that's what, decent new car, not even like a high end one. Like, you can get a car for that much. Like, I could potentially afford that. So that's not necessarily all that much money. And so we can expect to see other types of countries, even ones that are relatively poor, being able to field this capability. And having that ability to sort of like continually throw these systems against targets, I think is incredibly valuable and important for how they'll be used in military conflicts in the future.
Okay. Well, and from the reading that I've done on this, so the Ukrainians have described Russia's drones as reportedly being low, slow, and noisy. And they've said that 85% of these never even strike their intended targets. They're shooting them down, right? So that kind of leads me to wonder, do you think it's fair to compare these drones in some ways to Germany's V1 and V2 rockets from World War II? I mean, where they're being used, obviously they're intending to strike targets with them, but they're also being used as a form of a terror weapon.
Yeah, I think there's some degree of that. I know analysts debate a little bit, and I know a few folks are a little bit skeptical of that. I'm less sure myself. I think there is value in that sort of, or at least I think Russia may perceive value in that sort of terror weapon type of role. Because certainly, throughout the conflict, some of the things that Russia has tried to do continuously is sort of try to intimidate the population. And I don't think it's worked terribly well. I think that's one of the big surprises of the Ukraine conflict is how tremendously supportive the entire Ukrainian society has been for their war effort. So I don't think it's worked well, but I do think Russia has been trying to do that, try to show the population that we're going to keep coming, and you should sort of get sort of that fatigue over time, that like you just can't stand it anymore. So I can see drones sort of playing that role. It's also very possible that like part of the reason they're getting shot down is either the Ukrainian air defenses and counter drone defenses are stronger and a bit stronger than they are for Russia potentially. And then also depends on like the particular ConOps of like what Russia is doing, like because how exactly you fly the drone can make a difference in like how readily it's detected. If you fly really low, hugging the ground, then it's going to be much harder to detect the system. Whereas if you're flying closer, like a general aircraft where there's nothing else in the area, it's going to be a little bit easier to target that. So I don't know for sure that that's necessarily what that is not what Russia is doing. But I mean that there may be other reasons why they're getting just shut down. Like they're trying to use it that more effectively. And of course, the larger question is to what is Ukraine really using to defeat these drones? Like if they're using a bunch of really high-end air defenses, then like even if Russia is getting shot down a whole bunch, then that actually may end up being quite valuable for Russia if it's burning out those munitions and making it more difficult for Ukraine to respond against higher-end manned aircraft.
Yeah. Well, Zachary, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. I mean, there are so many, for me at least, these seem like tremendous firsts, and not in a good way, but firsts in terms of automation and warfare, and as you mentioned before, a lot of these things date back, decades, sometimes almost a century, but we're really seeing them kind of used on large scale in a first time. And so one of the other things that I think is a first here is Russia's quote unquote precision drones have been striking civilian targets in Ukraine, which is a form of indiscriminate warfare that's been condemned as a war crime by the United States. So for the first time, I believe, we have drones implicated in war crimes. What are your thoughts on this? And is there a way that we can help to maintain accountability for remote or automated weapons in the future?
I think there's a couple issues there that separate issues that I want to unpack and sort of differentiate. So if we talk about like general remote weapons, like just a drone in general, it doesn't strike me as like the accountability aspect is drastically different than any other form of accountability. That is because in that case, like we've had remotely operated weapons or weapons that are causing harm, certainly from a distance for forever. I mean, think about like a missile, like it's not necessarily remotely operated, but you are hitting a target that's way away from where the actual person who's pushing the button and saying, hey, go blow shit up. And so it's going to be heavily dependent on, the intelligence that the user is having, the quality of it. It's going to depend on the particular rules of engagement, when and how they engage. It's also going to depend on their own risk perception, as well as like the value of the target that they're engaging with. And so those general factors, I think, are equally applicable for drones, general remote piloted vehicles, which means that sort of the accountability mechanism is publishing awareness of like when things, haven't gone right, that say, hey, look, here's what happened, doing sort of a naming and shaming, look, here's Russia destroyed this particular hospital or whatever, it killed these many people, here's the reasons why we know it was Russia. Holding states accountable generally for war crimes is pretty difficult just in general, and there aren't terribly many mechanisms that one can use outside of naming and shaming. That said, that's not my area of expertise. So, someone listening to this like, well, there's, 5 other reasons, but, but there are certainly other potential areas like, targeted sanctions, that type of thing that may end up being fairly useful. But my point is, like, it's not necessarily drastically all that different for other weapon systems. Now, but I think that changes a little bit when we start talking about like more automated weapon systems and how exactly that aspect, that is what happens when weapon systems start being able to select and engage targets on their own without necessarily humans sort of having that accountability. And I think that changes the equation a little bit, because it sort of potentially pushes down that accountability in a different direction, right? Like if in the case of like, okay, let's launch a missile and blow this target up, there's a commander who's ostensibly responsible for saying, all right, push the button, go. But who's responsible if it's a machine that's making that decision? I think it at least becomes more complicated. Now, I think the commander who decided to use that is still going to have some level of accountability on that. But it becomes tricky if like the problem and the error is within the actual system itself. Like part of the issue you run into with some of these automated systems is that they're fairly brittle. That is, like a single pixel can cause it to believe that like a stealth bomber is a dog, that type of thing.
Okay.
So if you have that type of mistake, well, is it really the commander's fault, or is it really like the person who designed the system, like they didn't do the appropriate testing, or then is it the responsibility of the person who designed the requirements and did the tested evaluation? Like whose fault is that? That becomes at least more difficult, sort of establish that sort of exact responsibility in some of those cases and error. And that becomes more tricky, but of course that also depends on the degree to which those systems are actually used in combat. And I think that brittleness is part of the reason why we haven't seen as much of that. And I think you have some other questions about that, so I'll hold off on chatting too much about that. But one of the things we've seen is that at least Ukraine has not used that type of automated system, but they have acknowledged that they have that capability, that they could do that if they wanted to. They just choose not to. And I think we can expect to see that much more over the future.
Okay. Well, and that makes sense. I mean, again, so many of these issues it's almost like they start out with things that we're familiar with, and they're kind of moving towards new areas as automation becomes, I guess, more robust and it's able to do more on its own. Now, another area that, again, it seems like kind of a slippery slope is in the case of Iran, who's supplying these drones to Russia, they maintain that they're politically neutral, but they're supplying drone weapons, right? Now, the United States isn't actively engaged, but we are supplying arms to Ukraine. Okay, so the thing that I'd wondered about was, do these drones provide political deniability for automated reinforcements in future proxy wars? And, I mean, in a sense, if you give someone a gun, it's still a human being using it. It's their army, it's their military, right? But, if we're providing these automated reinforcements, how are robot soldiers different than real soldiers?
Yeah, I think to some degree it does offer that sort of like distancing from associating the conflict, but it's heavily dependent on the type of weapon system itself, and particularly the broader availability of that system. So if we imagine for the moment that, I decide to run my own drone company, Zach Incorporated, and we make our special drone, and I only sell it to one customer, right? Like the United States military, because I'm a bleeding heart patriot. So I only sell it to America and no one else, not even our allies, because I just love America. And then my Zach drone ends up showing up in a conflict somewhere. Well, it's reasonable to assume that like, okay, the United States provided that because like I only sell it to them, and so they're the only one who has it available. Or I'm a liar and I don't actually just sell it to the United States, and that's also a possibility too. But either way, there's a narrow scope of who does that. By contrast, if sell my Zach drones to just anyone and everyone, it's all over the world, then, if it shows up in a conflict, it becomes really, really tough. So the point here is I'm making, and we can compare that to more actual drones, is that like the relative availability is going to be a big factor in that deniability. So if you're talking about like a really high-end drone, like an MQ-9 Predator or something that's relatively narrowly available in a small number of states, then some of that plausibility kind of goes away, because you can kind of trace like, yeah, it came from one of like 3 countries. So we can kind of narrow it down a little bit. And certainly, a state is going to have some level of intelligence apparatus that may be able to figure out more details that aren't publicly available. By contrast, and I think this is where the really significant part is, if things are available everywhere. So we think about like the commercial DJI drones, where it's really available everywhere. Things like that, absolutely plausible deniability. So with like the DJI, for example, we've seen both Russia and Ukraine use those same types of drones to support them. I don't necessarily know where they're coming from, but like if there was some covert operation to just get a bunch of DJI drones into the hands of Ukrainians, oh, that's absolutely deniable, because like you can literally just go buy them from the store. So like there's nothing all that suspicious about it whatsoever. So I think that's where sort of that deniability aspect comes in. But yeah, it's going to be heavily dependent on the system itself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and to break that down even further, and again, this just adds to the confusion. America is involved in this conflict in another way, because computer processors in Russian drones have now been traced back to Texas Instruments, despite TI's claims that they don't sell components to Iran, right, which is where those drones are made. So I'm wondering, should there be corporate accountability in this area, or is it just too diffuse? I mean, it seems like in some ways, it seems like it's going to be inevitable just based on the global nature of parts sourcing, right?
Yeah, I tend to lead towards sort of the global inevitability in general, like, because we've seen this problem happen before. Like, I think it was during early in the Iraq War, there were some of the IEDs were using that like the insurgents were making to blow up U.S. soldiers were using like I can't remember, it was the detonators had specific components that were actually made by U.S. companies.
Okay. Yeah.
I believe the challenge, though, in that case is like, because some of these like components are so general between like both military and civilian, that like they become sold like all over the place, right? Like I just came back from Saudi Arabia, and like there's American products just all over the place. Not that Saudi Arabia is necessarily selling any of that to U.S. adversaries, but the point being is like these products are all over the place. And like, to what extent does like some random guy just hanging out his shop, are they aware of some of these export controls? Do they care? Maybe not. Are there even export controls? Because part of the challenge that like for a lot of the like restrictions over the past several decades have been primarily around like separating military and civilian technologies, things that are like very clearly used for military operations, like we don't sell those, or we have very careful control. So if you talk, like I'm more familiar with on the chemical and biological weapons side. So like certain types of laboratory equipment that you use to produce chemical weapons has really specific characteristics around like the hardening of the materials, and like the use of like specific types of materials that'll be resistant to like the really hazardous chemicals that you're working with. And commercial forms don't need those nearly as much. So it becomes relatively easy to put the restrictions, like, okay, these are the types of things that like you only really need for chemical weapons. And maybe there's a couple legitimate purposes, but we can restrict it fairly easily. And that makes it easy, because then we know who the actors are. We know who sells these things. And if someone messes up, like we can say, all right, it's clearly that dude. But that said, with some of these, the problem that we're seeing is, especially with drones as well as the subcomponents of drones, like there it just isn't that clear distinction at all between the commercial and the military. So it becomes very, very difficult. Like, so if we talk about the Texas Instruments example, okay, on its face, I believe it seems reasonable to me that Texas Instruments did not just go and sell these weapons or the components to Russia. Like, I suspect their due diligence part at least knows enough about that. But if, say, they sold a bunch to like a third-party supplier, or who then sold it to another third-party supplier, and down on the line, and then they're like, all right, we'll just give them to Russia. Like, that seems entirely plausible to me. And I think that does require some level of rethinking of like how exactly we deal with these export controls. And I don't know that there's a really good way to do that. That certainly goes beyond my level of understanding of the details of export controls, but certainly I think there is a need to think through some of those challenges, to what extent, if any, there even is. And my inclination is that there probably isn't, at least for some of these technologies that are just so heavily commercially relevant, like just drones. Like, you can just go get a DJI drone and like relatively wherever you want. So like the notion that we're going to control that, I don't buy it.
Yeah, no, I that makes total sense. Well, and also there's this gradient, right? When you say drone, it encompasses so many different things. So
Yeah.
I believe it's the Shahed 136. I think that's the one that Russia is using, the Iranian-made drone. And those definitely they're larger. They look relatively custom made, right? I mean, these are definitely military looking drones. The Ukrainians are using something called the Ram 2 kamikaze drone, which these were developed by a consortium of Ukrainian companies. They still have a range of about 18 miles. They can carry 6-pound warheads, and they were created through money crowdfunded by ordinary Ukrainians. Now, having seen these look basically like a lot of I would say large scale model airplanes, model gliders,
Mhm.
so it seems like there's a lot of variability depending on what kind of drone they're using, how it's designed, and then of course where those components come from for it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case for both good and bad. Like, there's just such a broad range. Like, well, yeah, one of my favorite examples in the Ukraine war was like the Lithuania crowdsourcing funding for the to buy Bayraktar TB2, and then Turkey's like, you know what, we'll just give it to you for free. You can use the donated money to like get humanitarian aid. Like, it's just a great example of both like the ways that drones have sort of like captured the public imagination, as well as sort of that combined of like the role of social media as well. And yeah, I think it's important that there is such like a broad range, and that also makes it really important to distinguish like thinking about like the roles of them in military conflicts. That is like some of these higher end drones, they're like essentially more or less substitutes for some larger like manned aircraft for states that don't necessarily have aircraft or don't necessarily want to risk it in those particular cases, like the Bayraktar or that type of thing. But at the same time, there's everything from that down to these commercial drones, which yeah, you can buy anywhere. And there you don't even have just like people needing to like crowdfund on social media, but like I've seen just traffic like just on my LinkedIn, like pretty overt stuff, or at least as overt as random public comments on LinkedIn are. But of people like, oh yeah, we're moving some drones into Ukraine, something like that, like just a bunch of just commercial stuff. And like that sort of illustrates the way that like individuals can sort of get involved with some of that stuff. And of course there the roles are potentially a little bit different. That is, you're using it more for potentially ISR. You might use it for carrying out actual strikes. That was an interesting one I saw the other day, that Ukraine was using 3D printers to create the little like bomb design, like the droppers for the bombs to add to the commercial drones. And so in theory, that's also something like the broader sort of civilian side can get engaged with. Like, you don't need to be a military person to play around with like a 3D printing build file, or even like just share it and distribute it, and be able to do that with it. So yeah, I think it's fascinating the way that like the broader public has been sort of engaged with sort of these drone efforts in Ukraine and elsewhere.
Yeah, this is a very different war. I was thinking about this the other day. To me, at least, it seems like this is the first true 21st century war. And again, I'm not saying that in a good way. It's
Yeah.
vaguely terrifying, right? But now, so in addition to these drone aircraft, drone planes, Ukraine has
Mhm.
a drone navy, which has turned out to be surprisingly effective. Forbes wrote that they are winning the Black Sea War, and a swarm of these 50-mile-an-hour robotic vessels assaulted the main Black Sea fleet in October,
Mhm.
blowing up at least one auxiliary vessel and possibly damaging the flagship, the 409-foot frigate Makarov. So again, these are drones, right? These are little boats taking on. I mean, this is a traditional navy, I guess, that the Russians
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, so I do think that's a fascinating case. Like, in one of the attacks, they used like 16 drones in total. I think it was like, I want to say seven or so unmanned surface vehicles and like nine aerial drones all working together, which that in of itself is significant, because although we've seen use of drone boats like a handful of times, like the Houthi rebels who carried out some attacks using unmanned surface vehicles, like this was using it in a fairly major conflict and using a whole bunch of them at once, and third in coordination with aerial drones at the same time. And I think that's very much indicative of sort of where this is going, where you have a whole bunch of drones operating together, carrying out actual attacks. Now, these were not true swarms in the way that I define them, meaning that they weren't communicating with one another. These are just independent drones operating at the same time. But what they allow is that to take attacks from like multiple different angles. If you have all these drone boats, you can have them all come together from like different approaches. If you have those
Mm,
aerial drones that can drop from the top, they can hit different types of targets at the same time. But I think the interesting part as well is that it's not actually clear how much damage these drones have done. But the reality is, like, even if they haven't, it's such a cheap attack, right? Like the unmanned
Yeah.
surface vehicles, like they're basically modified jet skis is really all there is. Like this isn't like some multi-million-dollar big gigantic vessel. Like this is something relatively simple and cheap. But despite that, even though they didn't do all that much damage, it is pretty clear that Russian naval behavior has changed. Increasingly, they're putting their ships on the Black Sea, home at port, where they aren't necessarily having the same sort of presence and aren't an ability to like cause harm to the Ukrainians. What's more, they're obviously building up quite a few more security measures, particularly booms around some of the harbors, to protect those ships from attack. So Russia's behavior has clearly changed. So even if the amount of damage from these boats is massively overstated, it's clearly caused a shift in behavior. So to the degree that Russia can't actually exert as much, naval power, that's a pretty larger like operational level win. And even if it wasn't necessarily like causing all that much harm. And again, it's a relatively low cost. So I think absolutely we can expect to see that type of attack in the future, not only with like these drone boats as well as drone aircraft at the same time, but of course you can imagine how that might shift in the future, where you say have more drone boats operating at once with more aerial vehicles. You may have them all connected and working together, and of course you might get undersea as well. As I think there were a couple of reports recently about unmanned undersea vehicles. I really don't like that phrasing, but were being provided to Ukraine as well. So conceivably, you could have all three domains in coordinating attacks against these sort of ships, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, there are just so many things and so much change here. So,
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about the nuclear aspect of this, because Russia is occupying a contested power plant in Ukraine. They've claimed in the past the Ukrainians are working on a dirty bomb, and they won't rule out using nukes themselves. And that story is kind of changing as we go, I guess, right? It's
Mhm.
shifting around, but that was what I was able to kind of piece together. So my worry was it's going to be a long, cold winter. And this is turning into what looks like kind of a war of attrition. Are you worried that somebody is going to choose the nuclear option?
I think it's worth worry. I don't know, like I don't lose all that much sleep on it at night. So first of all, I want to sort of unpack, because I think there's sort of two separate issues there. There's the Ukrainian dirty bomb, and then there's Russian nukes. So Ukrainian dirty bomb, I lose no sleep. I have zero concerns about whatsoever. So like the notion of a dirty bomb is like really just you put some radiological material in a regular bomb and then it causes harm. The reality is like the military effect is pretty minimal. Because most of the harm from just pure like radiological material is primarily like over long term from sort of like altering like genetics and increasing cancer risk. Like that's bad, but like in terms of like versus getting shot or blown up, like it's just honestly, I don't think it's that big of a worry. Most of the effects and why people worry about dirty bombs is primarily from like economic effects, like and the requirements of like cleaning up, like which that can have some harm. But like the notion that Ukraine is going to do that, like I don't see that it would really give them any real military advantage at all, and it would potentially cost them quite a bit, because Russia has very clearly been trying to build up a narrative to justify their war, and making claims about Russian chemical and biological weapons use. So like that would end up supporting Russia's goals. And actually, an amusing aside of that, a few months ago, RT, the Russian news outlet, reached out to me to come talk to them about potential for drones delivering chemical and biological weapons. Needless to say, I was like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna do that one. That one sounds not so good. But the point being, like they're trying to use that as a way to sort of retroactively justify their conflict. So like I don't see Ukraine using a dirty bomb at all. Russia using a tactical nuke, I think is more worrisome. I still put the probability is pretty low, mostly because I don't see all that much advantage in it, and I think that'll be sort of the main um, real question, as to what extent there's any real advantage in it. Like the one way I could see it being useful as is more of like a way to sort of de-escalate the conflict, sort of because Russians' current doctrine emphasizes like escalate to de-escalate. You kind of like ratchet things up so that you can like put pressure to move the conflict down to, and like sort of
Mm.
pull out of the conflict. And so I could kind of see it being useful there, like some sort of limited detonation, like in an area where there aren't too many people, just as a show of like, hey, we are ready to loose things if things get really out of hand. Let's maybe stop now, and you best back off. there have been some arguments that have gone around about whether there's sort of the value of using tactical nukes against, say, a like conventional military formation. I could see some arguments for that, just given like the amount of damage, but there are also some pretty strong arguments against, namely like if Russia uses a tactical nuke, like they may have to fight in radioactive, like the radioactivity is going to potentially mess with them, and like are they going to don a bunch of like hazmat gear, like that's going to reduce their effectiveness? Are some of these like not very well trained recruits, how are they going to deal with that? Are they even going to be willing to go into that sort of area? Yeah, so like, and I go back and forth on that. I could see some potential advantage, but of course, as soon as they use that, like the amount of international attention is going to be absolutely massive, and don't have any idea what the consequences of that might be. So I think it would inherently be a fairly risky move for them. So as I said, like overall, I'm not terribly worried about it. I think there's some chance, but I think it's pretty small that you would see nuclear weapons used.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, that was my worry. You'd mentioned, escalate to de-escalate, and so my concern was from a military perspective, right? Someone may regard a tactical nuclear device and say, okay, well, we can use this here to accomplish this goal, and it's going to send a scare message to this group of people, but politically, there's no distinction. Nuclear is nuclear, right? And so,
yeah, some say that. I don't know. I don't buy it. I think to some degree, yes, but I think the problem is that, like, that distinction often makes a whole lot of assumptions around U.S. and international response. I think the reality is we don't know what the response is, just based on a simple empirics of like that's never happened before. And
yeah,
like I think it's nice to talk about, oh yeah, the U.S. would massively respond, which I think is plausible. But honestly, I don't know if you had like a limited nuclear use in the middle of nowhere that didn't actually harm anyone. I honestly don't know what the response would be, like, because the U.S. would not want to escalate a lot of that. Like if it didn't actually harm anyone, like, would the U.S. actually want to deal with it? Like, yeah, there would probably be. I mean, there would be news coverage all over the place. Don't get me wrong. Like, so in that sense, yes, there would be like huge amounts of attention to what's actually happening. But would it like massively change the conflict? I don't know. And I think that's sort of the problem, is that I suspect Vladimir Putin also doesn't really know. So like I might be right that it's like not actually, he doesn't really do all that much, but at the same time, he might be very, very wrong. And so to what extent is, he willing to accept that risk and accept that uncertainty? And at the moment, not really sure. Like if Ukraine continues pushing forward and then maybe, I don't know, marches on Moscow or something, that seems unlikely. But in that scenario, I think then the calculation changes very
yeah.
radically in favor of even some of those more limited nukes, not only above like nowhere, but potentially more direct targeting of them.
Yeah. Well, Zachary, on that note, let me thank you again so much for your time today and for your expertise as well. Let me close by asking, what do you see happening next in Ukraine? And what are your largest near-term concerns in terms of this increasing use of automated weapon systems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in Ukraine specifically, like it seems pretty clear that Ukraine has had a lot of momentum going forward, I believe, taking back some of the territory that had previously been seized. And where that goes, I think will be interesting to watch. I think one of the debates I think we've already seen some of, but I think will especially expand, is if Ukraine continues to successfully like take back a bunch of territory, well, what happens then? What exactly is the United States and allied powers willing to support in terms of, say, punishing Russia? Like, what happens if Ukraine gets greedy and starts trying to take over some pretty clearly Russian territory? Like, what happens then? And I think there are at least a lot of defense folks, like in the United States, who would kind of be excited about that. I'm not sure it's necessarily that good of an idea. I recall back in part of the cause of like World War II is sort of the response within the German public to the reparations and costs that were imposed upon it following World War One. That is like where some of the, I can't remember the name of the agreement, but where Germany it was required to massively limit its military, had to pay all sorts of money to like France and all those other places, and in turn that sort of built a resentment that ended up sort of catalyzing the growth of like Hitler and the rise of fascism and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, there's a myriad of differences, and I'm not saying that it is exactly the same, but I do think there is that sort of social dynamic of that I think we can expect to see in Russia, just the same as like, okay, if we end up being really massively punished for it. Like, how does that affect the broader society in complex ways? I don't really know. It might not be a big deal, but I'd at least be very cautious about, going too far in terms of like, let's, damage and punish Russia for what I would generally agree is, clearly their fault and caused a lot of real harm. In terms of remotely operated systems, I think we can expect to see drones operating across multiple domains, absolutely, in more and more conflicts. And I think that's what a big part of what we're going to see. I think we're also going to see a greater use of autonomy, both in terms of just general autonomy, that is the ability of the machine to act without human control, which may be as simple as like just navigation, like go to point A to point B to point C without a human actually doing that. But I think you will also see greater potential use of autonomy for target selection and engagement, because we know Ukraine can do that. They've acknowledged that they can do that. We know, for example, that the Cargo 2 drone, the Turkish drone that was used in Libya a couple years ago, also had the capability to do that. The Turkish government eventually acknowledged that, yes, this can be used autonomously. They also acknowledge that like they haven't used it that way. But I think over time we expect that technology to be there, and the more states you have that have that technology, the more possibility you have as a state that's like, yep, we used it. We use this autonomous targeting capability. We think it's great, and we're going to use it. So I can expect to see that. I think we can also expect to see greater use of drones integrated into one another. So Israel, in May of last year, became the first state to use a true drone swarm in conflict, using like a couple dozen or so drones that all worked together. It was not an autonomous weapon in that it didn't select and engage targets autonomously, but they were operating as a coordinating unit. And I think we can expect to see much more of that, both with like small aerial drones, but also drones working again across multiple domains and just integrated weapon systems. We saw, for example, actually, there's just an article, really interesting, War in the Rocks today, around Turkey developing a drone carrier, like a sort of aircraft carrier, but meant for drones specifically for their, I think it's the next version of the Bayraktar, the TB3. So we can expect to see like things like that, where drones become more and more integrated into broader military systems, as well as that sort of question of like, do we really want manned systems, or are drones better for the particular approaches? Like, so in the Turkish case, that it sounds like they're removing manned fighter craft and putting the drones instead on that. So I think that'll be sort of a larger question, both for the military as well for sort of military culture of what does it even mean to be a soldier if like all of our weapon systems are robots that are controlled from afar.
Absolutely. Zachary, thank you again, sir.
Yep. Thank you for having me.